I'd known Noah for years now, ever since he was just a little kid. I married Greg when Noah was barely a teenager, and though he had always been a bit of a quiet kid, I could see how he'd grown up over the years. But lately, something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It started small, almost unnoticeable, like the way his voice seemed deeper now, or how he held himself differently. It was as if he was starting to carry himself like a man, not just Greg's son. I couldn't remember the exact moment it changed, but one day it hit me hard. I was in the kitchen, cutting up some vegetables for dinner, when Noah walked in. He was wearing one of those tight, faded t-shirts that seemed to cling to his body in all the right ways. His biceps were more defined than I remembered, and his jaw, once soft and boyish, now had a sharper edge to it. I felt a sudden rush of something I shouldn't have been feeling. My heart rate quickened, my palms felt a little sweaty, and I tried not to look at him too closely. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just his growth spurt catching up with me. But I couldn't shake it. The way he stood there, his chest rising and falling, casually adjusting his shirt like it was nothing. But I couldn't help noticing how different he looked. It was like he was a stranger, but not. I had seen him grow up, watched him go through awkward phases, the teenage rebellion and the insecurities of being in high school. But now, in his 20s, he seemed like a completely different person. A man. I tried to brush it off, focusing back on dinner, but I couldn't stop my mind from wandering. It was a strange feeling, like my eyes were betraying me. Every time he walked into a room, I'd catch myself watching him more than I should, trying to figure out when this change had happened. Was I crazy for feeling this way? I'd never thought about him this way before. He was Greg's son, for heaven's sake. I had never once seen him as anything other than that. But now, something was different. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I liked it, or if I was even in control of it anymore. And Noah? Well, he was different too. He seemed more confident now, more comfortable in his own skin. His jokes were sharper, his smile brighter, and there was something about his eyes, the way they lingered just a second longer than usual. Not that I could blame him. I was sure I was probably acting strange too. I couldn't look at him the way I used to, with the same easy indifference. Every glance felt charged, like I could feel the air thickening between us. It made me nervous, if I'm being honest. That night, after dinner, Noah was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. I sat down nearby, and as I did, I couldn't help but notice the way his muscles flexed when he adjusted his position, the way his biceps moved as he reached for the remote. His movements were smooth, controlled, so much more mature than I remembered. He looked like a man, and I couldn't deny that he was growing into someone who was in many ways impossible to ignore. And yet, as much as I tried to push it all out of my head, a part of me couldn't help but linger on the thoughts that kept coming to mind. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. The way he'd casually smile at me or crack a joke made me feel something else. I tried to ignore it, but there was no denying it. I felt drawn to him. It made me uncomfortable, but at the same time it excited me. My body knew it was wrong, but my mind couldn't stop the thoughts from creeping in. At that moment, I tried to laugh it off, tell myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. Every glance, every word, felt like it held weight now, and it terrified me to think of what might come next. Because in some twisted way, I knew that Noah had changed, and so had I. The days seemed to blur together after that first moment. Noah's presence was impossible to ignore. It was like everything about him had become more pronounced, more compelling. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just the kid I'd known for so many years. Now, he was a man, and every day that passed only seemed to reinforce that fact. It wasn't just his physical transformation, though that was certainly a big part of it. His muscles were more defined, his shoulders broader, his posture straighter. But it was the way he carried himself now, like he had some sort of quiet confidence that he'd never had before. That caught me off guard. He moved through the house with ease, making jokes with Greg and occasionally looking my way, as if he didn't mind holding my gaze just a little longer than necessary. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just him being comfortable, but deep down, I knew there was something more. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had begun noticing him in ways I hadn't before. It started small, like how I couldn't stop watching him when he walked into a room, or how the sound of his laugh made my stomach do strange flips. It was like I was hyper-aware of him in ways that went beyond the simple familiarity of living together. Each time I found myself in a room with him, my heart would race a little faster. There were moments when he'd look at me with this intensity, as if he could read my thoughts, and I couldn't help but feel a flutter in my chest. I hated myself for it, but it was impossible to ignore. The worst part was the way Noah seemed to be growing into this new version of himself. When he spoke to me, it wasn't the same old conversations we'd had when he was a teenager. Now his words felt more meaningful. He'd talk to me about his plans for the future, about things he wanted to do with his life, and I couldn't help but listen. He had an ambition in his voice that I found so incredibly attractive. There was something in his tone, a subtle shift that made me realize just how much I admired him now. It wasn't just physical, though I couldn't deny that he was incredibly handsome, but the way he seemed to understand the world in a way that few people his age did. He was thoughtful, introspective, and somehow in his quiet moments, he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Noah was starting to look at me differently too. I could feel it. The way his eyes would linger on mine during a conversation, the way he'd smile just a little bit longer. It wasn't overt or anything, no bold declarations or flirty comments. But there was an undeniable energy in the air whenever we were alone together, and I couldn't ignore it. I noticed it more and more as time went on. There was a look he would give me, a certain warmth in his expression that made me wonder if he felt the same way I did. Of course, I told myself I was imagining things. He was just being friendly. He was just being Noah. But every time I caught his eye, I couldn't help but feel the heat rise in my chest. It was like something was shifting between us, something unspoken, something dangerous. I kept trying to push these feelings away. This was ridiculous. He was my stepson. I was married to Greg. There was no room for anything like this in my life. But every time I saw Noah, every time our eyes met, it became harder to ignore. I didn't want to feel this way, but I couldn't stop it. And Noah, well, he wasn't blind. He knew what was going on. Or at least, I suspected he did. He was becoming more and more aware of the tension between us. The way his gaze would linger, the small, almost imperceptible smiles he'd give me when we shared a private moment. It was like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push things. He never said anything outright, but I could tell that he felt something too. He wasn't the boy I had known anymore. He was a man, and I was starting to see him in a completely new light. And that realization made everything feel so much more complicated. I knew I needed to put some distance between us, to stop these feelings before they went any further. But every time I was near him, it became harder to resist. It wasn't just the way he looked or the way he talked. It was the way he made me feel when he was around. I couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling the same pull I was, but that thought terrified me. Because if he was, then I was in trouble. It was a Tuesday night when things really began to change. Greg had been working late, and Noah and I had spent the evening just hanging out at home. The house was unusually quiet without the hum of Greg's presence, and I realized how much I had grown accustomed to having Noah around. It wasn't that I hadn't enjoyed his company before, but lately, every interaction with him felt different. He seemed more comfortable with me, more relaxed somehow, and I couldn't deny that the way he looked at me had changed too. There was a subtle shift, something lingering in his eyes that made me feel uneasy in the best possible way. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV. I tried to focus on the show, but I could feel Noah's presence in the room, even though he wasn't saying much. The air felt thick with unspoken things. Then, he walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel after cleaning up from making dinner. He wore a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, his damp hair falling loosely around his face. His movements were slow, purposeful, and suddenly, I was acutely aware of how grown up he seemed now. As he walked past me, I felt a slight shift in the atmosphere, a flicker of something in the air that made my heart skip a beat. It was a subtle thing, barely noticeable, but I couldn't ignore it. Noah paused for a moment, just behind me. I glanced up, expecting him to keep moving, but instead, he leaned over me slightly, placing a hand on my shoulder as he reached for the remote that was on the side table. The brief touch, his fingers brushing my skin, was enough to make my breath hitch. I tried to play it off, pretending that it was just an accident, that there was nothing more to it. But in that split second, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. It was like a spark, a crackle of something undeniable that I couldn't shake off. I immediately turned my attention back to the TV, trying to steady my nerves. But Noah didn't pull away right away. He lingered, just a second longer than necessary. When he finally moved away, I felt a strange emptiness where his touch had been. The moment passed, but the air still felt charged between us. I couldn't stop thinking about how it felt when his hand had been on my shoulder, how my body had reacted instinctively, as though it had been waiting for him to make that contact. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not by any means, but it was intimate in a way that unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a fluke, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was something more. It wasn't just the physical change I was noticing in him anymore. It was the way he made me feel when we were together. The subtle shift in our dynamic was becoming harder to ignore. The lingering touches, the glances, the way he would look at me with that knowing smile. It was all adding up, and I couldn't pretend I didn't feel it. Later that evening, as Noah sat down at the other end of the couch, I caught him staring at me. Not just a casual glance, but something deeper. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say or do. His gaze was intense, but it wasn't uncomfortable in the way I thought it would be. It was more like he was waiting for something, looking at me with an expression that seemed to ask if I could feel it too. I turned my attention back to the TV, trying to focus, but the growing awareness between us felt impossible to ignore. Noah's presence seemed to fill the room, and the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every word spoken, felt like it was heavy with something more than just the casual comfort of family. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in my mind. What had that touch meant? Was it a sign of something changing between us? Or was I just reading too much into it? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. Things weren't the same anymore. Our relationship had shifted, even if I didn't fully understand how or why. Noah was no longer just my stepson. He was something more now, something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening between us couldn't be ignored for long. It was late one evening when the air in the house seemed to grow heavier, thick with something unspoken. I was curled up on the couch, reading a book, trying to wind down after a long day. Greg had gone to bed early, as he often did when he was exhausted from work, and Noah had been spending most of his time in his room, focusing on his own projects. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. It had been that way for the past few days, like a strange energy was hanging in the air, lingering between us, making everything feel different. I was lost in my book when I heard footsteps approaching. The sound of the floor creaking beneath Noah's steps was familiar, but tonight it sounded louder, closer. I didn't look up immediately, assuming he was just passing through. But then he stopped. I felt his presence, solid and heavy, just behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a strange fluttering sensation began in my stomach. Something was different. I felt his eyes on me, and before I could even process what was happening, Noah's voice broke the silence, low and hesitant. "Jessica, can we talk?" My heart skipped a beat. There was a weight in his tone that I hadn't expected. I turned slowly, setting the book aside, my palms suddenly clammy. His face was serious, more serious than I had ever seen him before. There was no trace of the easygoing young man I was used to, no casual smile or playful glint in his eyes. This was something deeper, something that made my stomach twist with both fear and anticipation. He stood there for a moment, just looking at me, like he was trying to find the right words. I could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched before he spoke again, his voice slightly raspy. I've been thinking about something, and I don't know how to say it," he confessed. There was vulnerability in his words, something raw and honest that left me momentarily speechless. I had never seen Noah so open, so exposed. And in that moment, I could feel my own walls starting to crack. I waited for him to continue, but when he didn't, I gently nodded, urging him to go on. I've been feeling something for a while now, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Something more than just what we've always had. I don't know when it started, but it's been there for a while, and I think you might feel it too. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I had been trying to avoid confronting the growing tension between us, but hearing him admit it so plainly left me reeling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Could this really be happening? Was I hearing this right? You mean... I started, but my voice faltered. I didn't even know how to finish the sentence. He nodded, his eyes not leaving mine. Yeah, I've developed feelings for you, Jessica. I know it's wrong. I know it's complicated, but I can't deny it anymore. And I don't think you can either. You've been different too, haven't you? His words hung in the air, the silence that followed thick and heavy. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him that this was absurd, that I was just imagining things, but a part of me knew that I couldn't. Deep down, I had sensed it too. The growing attraction, the tension between us. I had tried to ignore it, tried to brush it aside, but now there was no denying it. Not after hearing him say it out loud. I didn't know how to respond. I felt a mix of emotions, shock, confusion, guilt, and I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Noah seemed to sense my hesitation, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything, he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor. I didn't mean to make things weird, but it was already too late. The moment had passed, and the truth was out in the open. I could see it in his eyes now, the way he was waiting for me to say something, anything. The weight of his confession hung between us, and I felt both terrified and strangely relieved. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could I say? Was there even anything to say? My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled, and I knew that this conversation, this moment, would change everything. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't escape the tension that hung in the air between Noah and me. Every glance, every fleeting touch felt charged, like there was something we were both trying to deny, but couldn't. I tried to keep things normal, laughing off the awkwardness, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, it was a different story. My emotions were a tangled mess of guilt, confusion, and desire. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they kept creeping up, taking control. Noah, too, seemed different. He wasn't the same carefree young man I had known for so long. He was bolder now, more assured, as though a new layer of confidence had emerged. He'd find excuses to linger near me, his proximity making my heart race, and I hated that I couldn't resist it. Every time he smiled at me, I could feel my resolve weakening. The boundaries I had so carefully built between us were starting to crumble, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. One evening, Greg went to his usual late-night meeting, leaving the house quiet and still. I was in the bathroom, getting ready for bed, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I thought nothing of it at first. Noah often passed by my room late at night, probably heading for the kitchen or his own bedroom. But this time, he didn't pass. I heard the soft tap of his knock at my door, followed by his voice. "Hey, Jessica, are you busy?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. "Not at all," I replied, standing in front of the mirror as I dabbed some lotion on my skin, trying to calm my nerves. "Just finishing up." A few seconds later, I heard the door creak open behind me. I turned, startled, only to find Noah standing in the doorway, his eyes locking with mine in an intense gaze. Something about the way he was looking at me made my pulse quicken. It wasn't just the usual friendly look, it was something deeper. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but beneath it, there was something more. A hunger, an unspoken desire. I had seen it before, but this time it was undeniable. And that's when I realized that, despite everything, I wasn't the only one struggling with this. He had been feeling it too. Before I could say anything, he took a step closer. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as he reached the doorframe, his body now inches away from mine. He didn't look away, and neither did I. The space between us seemed to vanish as the air around us grew thicker with every passing second. It was then that it happened. In one smooth motion, Noah reached out, his hand brushing against my arm as he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The contact sent an electric jolt through me, and my breath caught in my throat. "You know I can't stop thinking about what we talked about the other night," Noah said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He was so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating off his body. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Noah, we can't..." But I didn't finish the sentence, because in that moment, he leaned in, slowly. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though waiting for me to pull back, to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt myself drawn to him, my body betraying the very words I had just spoken. The kiss deepened, more urgent now, as if both of us were searching for something we had never allowed ourselves to acknowledge until now. I felt the weight of his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, and I couldn't help but respond in kind, my arms wrapping around him, my fingers tangling in the fabric of his shirt. The reality of what was happening crashed over me like a wave. This was crossing a line we had both been dancing around, and there was no going back. The guilt and confusion still lingered in my chest, but there was also a burning need that I couldn't deny. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. Neither of us said a word. What could we possibly say? The boundary we had both been so careful to maintain had been shattered, and there was no undoing it now. We stood there, lost in the tension of the moment, not knowing what the next step would be, but fully aware that we had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For better or for worse, everything had changed. After that night, nothing felt the same. The kiss, reckless and unplanned, had altered everything. The unspoken tension between Noah and me grew with every passing day, intensifying in a way that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. We couldn't avoid it anymore. The attraction was undeniable, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, I couldn't help but crave more of the connection we'd forged. It started with small fleeting moments, the way Noah would glance at me across the room, his eyes lingering just a second too long, or how he'd brush against me when passing by, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. These little gestures were enough to send my heart into overdrive, and I could tell he was feeling it too. Every time he was near me, it felt like the air between us thickened, charged with a current I couldn't escape. The electricity was always there, crackling in the space between us, and neither of us could deny it. I caught myself stealing glances at him when he wasn't looking, admiring the way his muscles had filled out over the past year, the way his clothes clung to his body just a little tighter, accentuating his growing physique. It was hard to ignore how handsome he had become, how much he looked like a man now, rather than the boy I had known for so long. And whenever he caught my eye, that knowing smirk on his face made my heart skip a beat. He knew. He knew what was happening, what had been building between us, and it was impossible to pretend otherwise. In the quiet moments when we were alone in the house, the tension seemed to bubble just under the surface, like it was waiting for the right moment to explode. Noah was never overt about his feelings. He didn't have to be. The little things spoke louder than words ever could. The way he'd stand just a little too close, or the way his voice would drop when he talked to me, like he was trying to create an intimacy that neither of us was ready to fully admit. At times, I tried to rationalize it. He was just a young man, navigating the complex emotions that came with growing up, and maybe this was just part of it. Maybe I was reading too much into his behavior. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just innocent attraction. It was something deeper, something forbidden. And no matter how hard I tried to distance myself from it, the pull between us was magnetic. It didn't help that Greg, my husband, seemed more distant than ever. He'd become wrapped up in his work, leaving me and Noah alone more often than not. Those quiet nights, when Greg was late coming home or busy with meetings, were when the tension was at its worst. In the absence of distractions, Noah and I would gravitate toward each other without even meaning to. And every time it happened, I felt the weight of our situation pressing down on me more and more. I couldn't deny it any longer. I was just as aware of the way he looked at me as he was of how I looked at him. And while I tried to push the feelings down, pretending that they were nothing more than fleeting thoughts, they only seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. Every touch, every glance was a reminder of what we were both avoiding, and the guilt that came with it lingered in the back of my mind. But there was also something else, a growing sense of anticipation, a hunger that neither of us knew how to tame. The tension between us was becoming unbearable, and I could feel it starting to seep into every moment we shared. The more we ignored it, the more it festered, and I knew we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't control, something that, once set into motion, would change everything. Noah was no longer just my stepson. He had become someone I couldn't stop thinking about, someone I couldn't seem to escape, even in my own home. And the more I tried to keep things normal, the harder it became to ignore what was growing between us. It was only a matter of time before we crossed another line. It all came to a head one evening. The atmosphere in the house had become increasingly thick with unspoken words, and I felt as though I was walking a razor-thin line, balancing on the edge of something dangerous. The night had started like any other. Greg was out again, working late, and I found myself alone in the living room. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as Noah moved around upstairs. I was curled up on the couch, reading a book, trying to lose myself in the pages. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to Noah. I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. His handsome face, his confident manner, the way he made me feel. It was like a drug, this attraction, and it was starting to consume me in a way I couldn't control. The door to the living room opened, and I looked up to see Noah standing there, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. He was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from a shower. There was something different about him tonight, something that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with a kind of certainty that sent a chill down my spine. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I set the book down, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to keep my composure, to pretend that everything was fine, but I couldn't. Not anymore. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it too." Noah stepped closer, and my breath hitched in my throat. This was it. This was the moment we had both been avoiding, the moment when the tension between us would either break or implode. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make my thoughts scatter, to make the world outside this room fade away. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my cheek, and I couldn't stop myself from leaning into his touch. The warmth of his skin, the tenderness of the gesture, sent a wave of heat through me, and for a moment I forgot who I was, who he was, and the consequences of everything that had come before. It was just him and me, two people caught in a moment that neither of us had the strength to pull away from. "Noah," I murmured, my voice shaky, as if I were begging for something I didn't fully understand. His gaze softened, and he stepped even closer, his lips hovering just above mine. "I can't stop thinking about you, Jessica," he confessed, his words barely audible. "I don't want to stop thinking about you." In that moment, I knew. I knew that there was no turning back. Whatever had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, maybe months, had reached its boiling point, and it was going to change everything. Before I could stop myself, before I could think of the consequences or the guilt that would follow, I kissed him. It was slow at first, tentative, as if neither of us could quite believe this was happening. But then the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. My hands found their way to his chest, pulling him closer, and I could feel his body pressing against mine, warm and firm. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The world outside this room, with its rules and expectations, faded away. There was only the kiss, only the feeling of Noah's lips against mine, the way his hands moved to my back, pulling me toward him as if we had both been waiting for this moment, this release, for far too long. When we finally broke apart, breathless. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. This was it, the point of no return. We had crossed the line and there was no going back. The consequences of this kiss, of this moment, would be something we would have to face. But for now, all I could feel was the undeniable pull between us, the desire that had been building for so long. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't stop it anymore. We couldn't stop it anymore. The night that changed everything began like any other. Greg had come home late, as usual, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. The guilt from what had happened between Noah and me still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I kept replaying the kiss in my head, the heat of Noah's touch, his words echoing in my mind. I can't stop thinking about you, Jessica. They were haunting me. There was no denying it. Things had changed, and I was caught in the web we had both woven. As I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to sip my coffee, I could feel the weight of Noah's presence from the other room. He was there as he had been for weeks now, but everything felt different. The space between us felt charged with a kind of electric tension that neither of us had the courage to acknowledge out loud. Greg, oblivious to anything beyond his own world, sat in the living room flipping through the TV channels. I wanted to talk to him, to say something, anything that would bring things back to the way they had been before this all started, but I couldn't. I knew it would be too late for that. The secret we were keeping, Noah and I, was only growing harder to keep hidden. It was then that the doorbell rang. My stomach dropped, and I instinctively looked at Noah. His eyes were locked on mine, and I saw the anxiety there, the fear of being exposed. But neither of us moved to answer the door. "I'll get it," Greg muttered, rising from the couch, not even noticing the tension hanging in the air. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. When Greg opened the door, I heard a voice I never thought I would hear. "Jessica?" It was Greg's best friend, Sean. He was standing in the doorway, a knowing look in his eyes. His gaze flickered briefly past Greg to me, and for just a moment I saw the faintest trace of suspicion in his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Hey, is everything okay?" Greg asked, turning to Sean. "Yeah, just wanted to drop something off," Sean said casually, stepping into the entryway. But I could feel his eyes on me, and something told me he wasn't just here to drop off a package. He knew. Something in his posture, in the way he looked at me, told me he knew. I forced a smile, hoping it wasn't as strained as it felt. "Hi, Sean. What's up?" Sean gave me a half-hearted smile. "Not much. Just thought I'd stop by for a minute." Greg was oblivious, engaging in small talk with Sean, but my nerves were on edge. I could feel the walls closing in, the sense that our secret was slipping through our fingers. As the conversation continued, I watched Noah. He had retreated to the hallway, his back to the wall, his expression unreadable. I could tell he was anxious too. Sean's presence only made everything feel more fragile, as if the world outside could come crashing down at any moment. And then it happened. Sean casually remarked, "You know, I've been noticing a lot of things around here lately." His voice was casual, but I could see the way he was watching me, his gaze heavy with meaning. "You two seem closer than usual." My heart skipped a beat and my mind raced. Had he noticed something between me and Noah? The tension between us was becoming too obvious. Sean's words hung in the air, a chilling reminder that our secret couldn't stay hidden forever. Greg laughed it off, but I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. This was it. This was the breaking point. Sean knew. Whether he had figured it out from the way we looked at each other or from something else, I couldn't tell. But I knew now that things were out of control. I excused myself from the conversation, retreating to the kitchen, where I could feel the walls closing in on me. The pressure of the situation weighed down on me. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and there was no way to turn back. The consequences of what I had done were inevitable. Noah came into the kitchen after a moment, and I could see the frustration on his face. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, looking like a man who had reached the end of his rope. "This can't go on much longer," he said quietly, his voice full of tension. "If Sean knows, if anyone finds out." "I know," I whispered, "but I don't know what to do. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant for us to..." Noah stepped closer to me, his hand reaching out to touch mine. It doesn't matter now. What matters is what we're going to do next. But I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I could keep living this lie, if I could keep pretending that everything was okay. The secret had already begun to unravel, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. What would happen now? Would Greg find out? Would everything fall apart? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? One thing was certain. Whatever happened next, our world would never be the same.